On behalf of the Presbytery of Giddings-Lovejoy and the Committee for Local Arrangements, we welcome you to the 223rd General Assembly in St. Louis, Missouri, as we seek the kingdom of God together. Volunteers and leaders from all over the Presbytery have come to welcome you and showcase the love and commitment we have for Christ, our communities, and our world. Our presbytery is built on a confluence of the great rivers Mississippi, Missouri, Illinois, and Ohio. So too is our community a confluence of diverse congregations, urban and suburban, town and country, large and small, old and new.
St. Louis is a city with a lot of small town in it.
We grew up in the suburbs of St. Louis, and from an early age we were enamored with the city. Our dad used to drive us around his old neighborhood on the north side and point out where his grandpa's shoe store was and all the different businesses and the streetcar tracks, and it really painted this picture of this cool urban neighborhood that had fallen on hard times, but we saw that the bones to be great were still all around us.
That rich heritage of the immigrants who came here, of the Native Americans who were already here, the African Americans, all of those different incredibly rich and important strands go together to make up, I think, a world-class city.
St. Louis has a lot of the attractions of a city, but the people who will claim the area spreads out wide and far, and you don't have to travel too far before you hit a cornfield.
The Presbytery of Giddings-Lovejoy currently has 80 congregations, serving approximately 12,400 members, spread out across 255 miles. And in addition to the plethora of amenities and the ways in which we celebrate our history, the region faces a number of socioeconomic challenges that are rooted in our regional history.
Largely, we are a region in the Midwest that's in the center of a country that is founded on hundreds and hundreds of years and legacies of oppression.
Missouri was still a slave state or a proponent of slavery. I don't think that thought has entirely been erased. I think it has transitioned down through generations. I think understanding how polarized this city is still, the division between St. Louis City and St. Louis County.
While other cities are competing with other major metropolitan areas, we're still busy competing with our own suburbs.
While we have the metro area, we also have 90 surrounding municipalities. And that's an important piece of history to know, because it really is part of what St. Louis is, that we are very easily kept in our own municipality and we don't branch out very far.
Until I came back home from undergrad, I had only really socialized and visited things in my area. I think St. Louis sometimes can be very polarizing. If you live west, you stay west. If you live north, you stay north.
The system here in St. Louis is structured so that police disproportionately pull over poor, and in our region, black people and people of color. And often people don't have the money to pay the fine because they can't pay the bail on their warrant. They end up being put in prison. And so this is very much like the old-fashioned kind of debtor's prison, and it is very much at work in St. Louis.
Whether it's the zip codes, school districts, redlining, as time goes on, it still sometimes seems like we're living in the 1800s or early 1900s with the racial divides.
An historian named Nathan B. Young called the city #1 in civil rights. Perhaps one of the very first civil rights protests in the history of the nation happened in St. Louis in 1819 on the steps of the old courthouse, when free African Americans and white supporters gathered to protest against Missouri entering the Union as a slave state. And that history of protest continues up through the present day. It's a rich, important history connected to many Supreme Court cases, like the Dred Scott decision in 1857, to Shelley versus Kramer, which ended judicial enforcement of restrictive covenants in housing that said you could discriminate on the basis of race.
Those legacies are embodied here in a very particular way, but they belong to the whole country. And then the way those are lived out and structured into our lives in what we often refer to in public education as achievement gaps, but are really opportunity and wealth gaps.
I attended Graceville High School in St. Louis, public schools. And to hear the stories that go back to the 1950s and 60s, that these black teachers for the black schools in North St. Louis, how they had to fight for materials and services for the black students. Our books were always used books that came from South St. Louis. Our sports equipment always secondhand. The teachers' pay substandard. And that they had to fight every step of the way for us to get an education. And to know that that continues today, that hurts.
So from St. Louis, we're about 40 to 45 minutes south. A lot of these towns in this area were factory towns. Crystal City in particular is called Crystal City because it was built by Crystal Plate Glass Company, which was a British company, and they even built the church here. This community really had its heydays throughout the 50s and the 60s when the glass factory was here. The majority of people here in the community were working for the glass factory. But then in the 90s, the factory shut down. They went from being one of the most elite towns in the area to being a community where now a third of the community lives at or below the poverty level, and where about 50% of the children in the school district are on free and reduced lunch program.
If we're going to be a people of the marginalized, then we need to think about the people who are at the margins of our own community. And I think that if we practice good ministry to them, that could be really good practice for the rest of us to do good ministry in our immediate context.
Unless you make a point of going into different places and going to different areas, you don't have to. And so you have to be intentional about building those communities.
How do you find the hope in all of that? How do you find where God is taking you into the future from that?
With the missionary zeal of Salmon Giddings and standing in the stream of justice embodied by the abolitionist Elijah Parrish Lovejoy, churches of the Presbytery and the community at large work tirelessly to transform St. Louis and the whole of the region, affecting positive change and implementing a number of programs.
We need to step back and recognize, first of all, we're two different churches, two different communities, two different cultures, and we need to go back and start to learn each other's cultures better.
A couple of guys from Darden was adamant at the fact that they didn't believe white privilege existed. So after about 12 minutes without taking a breath, they said, oh, I understand it now, because what they equated, if someone says you have white privilege, that means that you're a racist. They coupled them together. And I had to break them apart to let them know as white privilege is what you have just by being white in this country. But the racism comes when you use that privilege in an oppressive way.
I think Ferguson, for many of us in St. Louis, became a kind of crisis point of awakening our ability to see that in a new way. So it was really young people in the street who woke us up a little bit and got us to see, oh my goodness, we are tied into these structures and into the source of this lament.
But what's really neat in my community is that I see a whole host of people who are embracing it. And instead of looking at this as like, how do we handle diversity, it's how do we make sure that we're doing inclusion?
In 2013, I started looking around and saying, do we know the needs of our own community? Urban Plunge was born out of that question because so many of our students would go to school in their municipality, in their area, and they would never go downtown into the metro area.
We're trying to work a lot with children. There's an organization called the Jefferson County Homeless Youth Initiative, and it's an organization that helps the 175 homeless teenagers in the county to make sure they stay in school and get an education, and even offer some scholarship money to the local community college.
A variety of clergy kind of found one another and began to think about how we might learn from the predominantly young and black and often queer folk who were bravely standing in the street and calling out and crying out for justice. And then we began to organize through organizations like Metropolitan Communities United, and that organization drew people of different ecumenical traditions. But Ferguson kind of created a way to focus our efforts and rededicate our efforts around fighting structural racism.
I was in prison since I was a teenager for 22 years. I decided to do it, and they do like 6 months within the institution, and I did the classes, and I got out and went to the academy, and it was more than what I really expected. Everything that they told me that they would help me with, they actually did really help me with. I'm better today than what I was yesterday. I'm better today than what I was 10 years ago and 22 years ago.
So the Presbyterian Church, the General Assembly, has moved to challenge the system in St. Louis by taking an offering, and on Tuesday we will take that money to the St. Louis City Jail and bail out hundreds.
I emphasize the building of the kingdom or the Kindom. Theologically, most members of the congregation, when you say kingdom of God, they think heaven after you die. What I emphasize to my congregation is no, we're building the kingdom here and now in this community. I think once that understanding of what the kingdom or the kingdom is, that's when things started changing.
Wherever we see shortcomings in our neighborhood and our community, Co-Berean is saying we're ready to step up and fill the void.
If you just show up and say, I'm willing to actually do work and help, you're like amazing to people. The city of Belleville changed the community-wide service day to make sure that First United Presbyterian could be there. And I was just like, touchdown Jesus.
What I hope the commissioners do is not simply say, oh, well, we went and helped out in St. Louis, but to learn from that these practices are going on all over the United States, and they're embodied in different ways in our regions. And so to go home and to learn about that and to create relationships of solidarity in their communities with other people of faith and no faith at all, to interrupt and stand in solidarity.
At one of the high schools, they had been going on Urban Plunge. During the school year, they got a group of other students together to go back to one of the agencies, Cornerstone Early Childhood Development Center. That was the whole purpose of this program, was helping these students learn about those needs and then discovering ways that they can take actions to be agents of change.
Imagine a multicultural, multiracial, just different ethnicities. That's what church is.
Going into different communities and listening, and then in response to that, asking, what do you need from us?
Drive your city, look out your windows, ask the question, why are things the way that they are? And then ask yourself, am I willing to participate in being an agent of change?
Some ways of doing church and being church have to die so that the new ways of being church that Christ is leading us into can be resurrected. And how do we do it in a way that's loving and caring and where people don't just feel left behind?
It's a work in progress, and it kind of attracts people who want to be part of that work in progress. It breeds doers.
Let's just go out and actually do some stuff so that when people hear like, oh, the Presbyterian Church is here, that they'll actually think, oh, well good, finally something's going to get done.